There's a moment that happens in almost every kitchen in this country. You open the freezer, pull out a pack of beef patties, and for half a second, you just look at them. Grey, slightly frosted, stacked like hockey pucks. And you think, this is fine, right? It's beef. It says beef on the box. How different can they really be from each other? That question is exactly what a panel of Australian meat experts set out to answer earlier this year, and the results are the kind of thing that changes how you shop. A blind taste test of 14 beef burger patties from Coles, Woolworths, Aldi and IGA didn't just rank the products. It exposed a gap so wide that two of the country's biggest supermarkets ended up selling patties that scored 10%, not 70, not 40, 10. And this isn't an isolated result. Consumer advocates have run similar blind comparisons on beef sausages for years, and the pattern keeps repeating itself. Different judging panels, different years, different products, and yet the same three retailers keep landing in slightly different order every single time, depending on what's actually being measured. Sometimes it's fat content that separates the winner from the loser. Sometimes it's sodium. Sometimes it's the percentage of meat that's actually in the product. What never changes is the underlying lesson. These companies are not competing on quality first. They're competing on hitting a price point, and quality is whatever happens to survive once that price point is locked in. We're going to walk through exactly what separated the passing patties from the ones that failed. What a wider look at supermarket meat testing tells us about the whole category, why the failures happen at a scientific level, and what all of this actually means for the meat sitting in your own freezer right now. Let's start with how a test like this even works, because it matters. This wasn't a marketing survey or a customer satisfaction poll. 3 professional judges did the tasting, and between them, they've spent decades with their hands on meat. One has run a small goods business for over 25 years and trained formally in food sensory evaluation. Another built his career working alongside one of Australia's most respected chefs, running the kitchens of some of Sydney's best-known restaurants before moving into ethical butchery. The third is a working butcher who's been curing and smoking meat professionally for decades. None of them knew which brand they were eating. The patties were cooked identically, presented in a randomized order, and scored purely on how they looked raw, how they looked cooked, how they smelled, how they tasted, and how they felt in the mouth. No packaging, no price tag, no brand loyalty creeping into the score. Just the product, stripped of everything companies spend millions of dollars trying to convince you matters. That's the part worth sitting with for a second. Every one of those 14 packs on the shelf looks basically the same to a normal shopper. Red and white packaging, a photo of a juicy burger, words like quality and value printed somewhere on the front. The entire job of that packaging is to make the decision for you before you've thought about it. Strip all of that away, and what's actually inside becomes impossible to hide. So what did the panel find? At the top of the table sat a Coles Finest range Angus burger, scoring 77%, the only product in the whole test to comfortably clear the bar. Judges described it as having a balanced, mild beef flavor with a pleasant aroma when cooked. The kind of result you'd expect from a product that was also the most expensive per kilogram in the test. A Woolworths option built from chuck and brisket cuts came in second at 70%, praised for visible mint strands in the raw patty and a well-seasoned beefy flavor once cooked. Here's the pattern already starting to form. Both of the products that actually performed were fresh, not frozen, and both leaned on named cuts of meat rather than vague catch-all descriptions. That's not a coincidence, and we'll come back to exactly why in a moment. Now for the failures, because this is where it gets uncomfortable. Sitting at the very bottom of the ranking, tied at 10% each, were Coles Simply Beef Patties and Woolworths Beef Baddies, and Woolworths Beef Burgers, both frozen, both from the cheapest tier of each retailer's range, and both, according to the panel, barely recognizable as beef once cooked. One was described as mushy with no real beef flavor and a taste that judges called unnatural. The other was described in blunter terms, pale, greyish-white in colour, tasting unbalanced, more like eating a binding agent than eating meat. Read that again. 2 of the largest grocery chains in Australia currently stock a product labelled as beef burgers that professional tasters scored at 10%, the same low tier the entire frozen category landed in. The editorial director overseeing the test was blunt about the takeaway, Price and performance actually lined up here, and shoppers would be better off skipping all three frozen options tested and sticking with fresh. It's worth pausing here to ask whether this is a one-off or whether it's actually how supermarket beef behaves as a category. Look at what's happened when the same kind of testing has been run on beef sausages, and you start to see the shape of something bigger. In one comparison, Woolworths Snags came out with the lowest sodium of the three major chains, but also the highest fat content, and around 73% meat. Coles, in that same comparison, had the lowest fat but the highest sodium, at roughly 750 milligrams per 100 grams, and the lowest declared meat percentage of the three at 70%. Aldi undercut both on price but didn't specify its meat content on pack at all. Run the exact same three retailers through a different comparison on a different occasion, and the order flips entirely. Coles comes out on top for taste, then run it again with a fresh panel, and Aldi's cheapest thin sausage wins outright, beating out pricier gourmet options from the same shelf. None of these results contradict each other because they're not measuring the same thing. One test cares about sodium, another cares about meat percentage, another cares purely about how it tastes off the barbecue. A shopper glancing at a wall of near-identical packaging has access to none of that. All they get is a photo of a sizzling snag and a price per kilo. That's the real mechanism at play here, and it has a name in consumer psychology: the health halo effect, or more broadly, the halo effect, or more broadly, once a product signals one positive attribute, a premium-sounding name, an appealing photo, a slightly higher price that implies quality, our brains tend to generalize that positive impression across the whole product, including attributes we haven't actually checked. You see finest or premium on a label, and some part of your brain quietly assumes the ingredients, the sourcing, and the texture are all better too, without you ever reading the fine print. Marketers know this. It's why packaging design leans so heavily on cues like natural wood textures, hand-drawn fonts, and words like farmhouse or traditional that have no regulated meaning whatsoever, but do a lot of psychological work before you've picked the product up. So why does the actual eating quality gap happen? Why can two products, both legally called beef patties, sitting a few meters apart on the same shelf, end up worlds apart in quality? The answer sits in a mix of food science and food law. And once you understand it, you'll never look at a patty the same way again. Start with the meat itself. A fresh burger patty made from named cuts like chuck and brisket is essentially just seasoned mince, shaped and chilled, sold within days. There's very little engineering involved. The texture you taste is the texture of the muscle fiber itself, plus whatever fat is naturally marbled through those cuts. Chuck in particular has a good balance of connective tissue and fat, which is part of why it's a classic mincing cut for burgers in the first place. It holds together and stays juicy under heat. Cheaper frozen patties are a different product entirely, even when the label says beef. To hit a lower price point, manufacturers often use lower-grade offcuts and trim, mechanically processed and bound together with additives designed to hold water and shape. Freezing itself changes the texture too. As water inside the meat freezes, it forms ice crystals that rupture the muscle cell walls. When the product thaws and cooks, that ruptured structure releases more liquid than it should, which is exactly the mushy texture the judges kept describing. It's not that the manufacturers did something illegal. It's that the entire process, from the grade of meat used to the freezing method, is optimized for shelf life and cost rather than eating quality. And here's where the regulation angle comes in, because Australia does have rules about this. They're just narrower than most people assume. Under the Food Standards Code, products like sausages have to contain at least 50% fat-free meat flesh by weight, with the remaining fat content capped as a proportion of that. That standard exists specifically because, historically, sausage was a category ripe for stretching with fillers, and regulators drew a line. But that line defines a floor, not a benchmark for quality. A product can sit right above that floor, technically compliant, and still taste like almost nothing. This is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire test. Legal and good are not the same thing. A 10% patty and a 77% patty can both be completely compliant with Australian food law. Nobody broke a rule. The label isn't lying to you. It's just that beef burger describes a category wide enough to include both a butcher quality chuck and brisket blend, and a frozen product built primarily to hit a price point, with taste and texture as an afterthought. enforcement of these standards also sits with state and territory food authorities rather than a single national body watching every product on every shelf in real time. EFI SANS sets the rulebook, but the day-to-day checking is distributed, under-resourced relative to the sheer size of the grocery sector, and mostly reactive rather than proactive. That's not a conspiracy, it's just the practical reality of regulating an industry this large. It also means the gap between technically legal and actually good isn't something regulation is ever likely to close on its own. That gap gets closed by information, by testing, by ingredient literacy, by shoppers who know what to look for, not by waiting for a stricter law to arrive. So how do you actually use this next time you're standing in the meat aisle? A few things from this test translate directly. First, fresh consistently outperformed frozen here, and that lines up with the food science. If a product needs to survive months in a freezer and still look appealing, something in the formulation is usually built for durability rather than flavor. Second, look for named cuts on the label, chuck, brisket, blade, whatever it is, rather than generic terms like beef mix or beef product. Naming the cut is a small thing, but it tends to correlate with a manufacturer willing to show you exactly what's in the pack because they're proud of it rather than trying to obscure it. Third, and this is the one that stings a little, price wasn't a scam here, it was actually informative. The cheapest products in this specific test were also the worst performers. That won't always hold true across every category of food. Broader supermarket pricing surveys have repeatedly found Aldi to be the cheapest place to do a full grocery shop overall, sometimes by a wide margin compared to Coles and Woolworths, without that translating into lower quality across the board. So cheap doesn't automatically mean bad, and expensive doesn't automatically mean good. What this particular test showed is narrower and more useful than a blanket rule within this specific category. On this specific category, the products built to hit the lowest price point also happen to be the products built without much regard for how they'd actually taste. Sometimes the extra few dollars per kilogram is buying you a genuinely different product, not just a nicer photo on the packaging. Sometimes it isn't. The only way to know which situation you're in is to look past the label. None of this means every home brand or budget option is automatically bad. Some of the best value products in Australian supermarkets are exactly the ones you'd assume are corner-cut, home brand basics that happen to use decent ingredients because there's no premium marketing budget to pay for instead. What this test really argues for isn't brand loyalty in either direction. It's blind testing. The kind that strips away branding and price expectations, because that's one of the only reliable ways to find out what you're actually getting. And when that testing exists and gets published, it's worth paying attention to because most of us are making these calls in about 4 seconds of shelf time, based entirely on a photo and a price, with zero access to what a trained palate would tell us if it got there first. There's also a simple habit worth building that doesn't require waiting for the next blind taste test to come out. Flip the pack over before you flip it into the trolley. Look past the hero photo on the front, past the words like value or family favorite, and read the actual ingredient list and the meat percentage if it's declared. If a product doesn't declare its meat content clearly, that absence is itself a data point. Compare the price per kilogram, not the price per pack, since pack sizes are engineered to make comparison harder, not easier. None of this takes more than 15 extra seconds once it's a habit, and it's the closest thing to running your own mini blind test right there in the aisle. The bigger picture here isn't really about beef patties at all. It's about how much of what we buy is shaped by trust we've never actually verified. 2 products, same supermarket, same category, same general price bracket in some cases, and a 67-point gap in actual quality once you take the packaging away. That gap doesn't show up anywhere on the shelf. It doesn't show up in the price. It only shows up when someone does the unglamorous, unpaid work of cooking all 14 blind side by side and writing down exactly what a trained palate notices that the rest of us don't get the chance to. That's also worth saying plainly why independent testing matters as much as it does. Supermarkets aren't obligated to tell you which of their own products underperform. Why would they? Both of the failing patties in this test are still sitting on shelves right now, in the same fridges as the products that scored 70% higher. The only reason any of us know the difference exists is because someone with no financial stake in either brand sat down, cooked all 14 without knowing which was which, and published the results for anyone to read. That's a rare thing in a grocery aisle built almost entirely around persuasion. It also reframes something a lot of us have quietly blamed ourselves for. If you've ever cooked a pack of cheap patties and wondered why they turned out grey, watery, and flavourless compared to what you remember from a butcher, that wasn't a failure of your cooking. It was, in a fairly literal sense, the product doing exactly what it was engineered to do: survive months in a freezer at the lowest possible cost, with taste treated as a secondary concern. So next time you're standing in front of a wall of near-identical packaging, reaching for patties or sausages or mince, it's worth asking the same question this test was built to answer. If you stripped away the box, the photo, and the price tag, would you actually be able to tell this product apart from the cheapest options sitting in the freezer next to it? For two products in this test, the honest answer was yes, and not in a good way. The label said beef. The panel said something closer to filler. Now you know what to check before it ever hits the pan: the cut named on the pack, whether it's fresh or frozen, and the price per kilogram rather than per pack. And that's 15 seconds of label reading standing between you and finding out the hard way at your own barbecue in front of your own guests.